The 29th of July, 1943. The 5th day in the concrete tomb. The air had become a viscous, hot mass, saturated with the smell of sweat, fear, and scorched stone. It didn't fill the lungs. It scratched them from the inside with dry, prickly crystals of despair. 200 souls, or what was left of them, were trapped in a public air raid shelter beneath the Hamburg district. This was no longer Hamburg. It was a sarcophagus. In the center of this small, man-made hell, illuminated by the dim light of a single, miraculously intact emergency lamp, stood a man. His name was Hans Vogel. He was 62 years old and a retired fireman. Now, he was their dictator, their prophet, and their executioner. His face, caked in a layer of concrete dust, resembled an ancient mask. His deep-set eyes burned with a cold, analytical fire, one that had no room left for pity or fear. He looked at a young man, Klaus Richter, who lay exhausted on the floor, wheezing and glaring at him with hatred. Klaus's hands were battered and bloody. "Work." Hans's voice was quiet, but it seemed to weigh a ton. It was not a request. It was a sentence. Beside Klaus lay a heavy, makeshift hammer, a piece of steel rebar wired to the splintered leg of a bench. Beneath it, in the center of the concrete floor, gaped a small but deep crater, like a wound in the body of a stone giant. For several days, without sleep and with almost no water, these people, taking turns, had been striking a single point. They were not trying to get out. Outside was the hell that was killing them, sucking the life out through the ventilation shafts. They were trying to break through downwards, into the inferno beneath the inferno, into the city's sewer system. This idea, born in the mind of the old fireman, had at first seemed like the ravings of a madman. Now, it was their only prayer. A prayer of concrete and steel. A prayer they were crafting with their own bloodied hands. Around them in the semi-darkness, others sat and lay. Women, the elderly, children. Their breathing was shallow, ragged. Some were no longer breathing at all. They had simply grown quiet, like wax figures in a museum of catastrophes. A small boy of about 7, Otto, gasped for air, his chest heaving in convulsive, desperate attempts to find a single drop of oxygen. His mother, Greta, held him, rocking him and whispering something in a feverish delirium. She looked at Hans with pleading eyes, but his gaze offered no answer, only a command. "Work, Klaus, or your turn to breathe will never come." Slowly, with inhuman effort, Klaus raised the hammer. A strike. A dull, thick sound swallowed by the general apathy. Another strike. And another. Each blow robbed them of the precious remnants of air, but offered the ghostly hope of a single, life-saving breath. A breath that would smell of filth and decomposition. A breath that would mean life. But to understand how 200 civilized German citizens, fathers, respectable burghers, and pious fraus had turned into a primitive tribe, fanatically drilling a hole into hell, we must go back several days. To the evening when the sky over Hamburg had not yet become the lid of a giant furnace, and the concrete walls of the shelter still seemed a symbol of unshakable safety. The 27th of July, 1943. Hamburg. The air was warm and humid, smelling of the port, of coal, and of the roses blooming in the front gardens. The war had been going on for almost 4 years, and the city had grown accustomed to the wail of sirens, to the blackout curtains on the windows, to the anxious reports from the front. But this was an addiction to a known danger, to a ritual that had a beginning and an end. The siren, the descent into the shelter, reading, whispered conversations, children's games in the dim light, the all clear, the return to their apartments, to their lives. That evening, everything was as usual. The Richter family, Klaus, a young engineer, and his pregnant wife Lena, descended the concrete steps of the public shelter on Hammerbrucker Strasse. Klaus carried a small suitcase with documents, water, and a couple of sandwiches. Lena clutched a volume of Rilke's poetry. They were young, in love, and not even the war could take away their faith in the future. "It will all be over soon, my love," Klaus said, stroking her belly. "We'll name him Max. He will build new houses, not hide in basements." Inside, the shelter was already buzzing like a disturbed hive. About 200 people, residents of the neighboring buildings, had settled on the wooden benches along the walls. Everyone was here. Old Herr Schmidt, the baker, with his portly wife, the strict teacher Fräulein Adler, who even here tried to maintain discipline, Pastor Emil, whose quiet, confident voice soothed the most anxious. And there was Hans Vogel, a former brandmeister, a fireman with 40 years of experience. He sat in the farthest corner, alone, reading an old, battered book on hydraulics. No one noticed him. He was part of the interior, like these gray concrete walls. An old man, past his prime, one of many. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort anyone. He just sat and listened. But he wasn't listening to the people's conversations. He was listening to the bunker itself. He heard the hum of the ventilation, the creak of the wooden floors under the weight of hundreds of bodies, the vibration of the earth from distant, still distant explosions. To others, it was just noise. To him, it was a symphony of impending catastrophe. He knew the nature of fire better than anyone else in this dungeon. Fire was his old enemy, his teacher, his god, and he felt its approach not with his ears, but with his skin. The air today was different. It was electrified, heavy. Outside, the growing roar of the Lancaster and Halifax bombers was not like usual. It was denser, lower, pressing on the eardrums. This was not a normal bombing raid. This was an execution. Klaus Richter found a spot for Lena on a bench, covering her shoulders with a blanket. He was confident in the strength of these walls. Concrete 2 meters, about 6.5 feet, thick, steel doors, an air filtration system, German engineering embodied in stone. What could possibly happen? But Hans Vogel stared at the ventilation grill near the ceiling and frowned. He did not see salvation. He saw the Achilles heel of this concrete colossus. That evening, as usual, he spoke to no one. He simply watched as the main lights went out, the emergency lighting kicked in, and the roar outside intensified. He didn't suspect that his knowledge, accumulated over decades of fighting fires, would soon be the only thing standing between these 200 people and a slow, agonizing death by suffocation. He did not yet know that the sound he would hear in a few hours would not be the thud of an enemy shell on the shelter's roof, but the sound of superheated air beginning to suck the life out of this hermetically sealed crypt. The first impact was so powerful that the concrete floor swayed underfoot like the deck of a ship in a storm. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the single emergency lamp flickered and died for several agonizing seconds, plunging the shelter into absolute primal darkness and provoking a wave of screams from women and children. When the light returned, dim and yellow, the world had changed. The air was filled with the smell of ozone and fear. The roar outside was no longer a series of separate explosions. It had merged into a single, continuous, low-frequency rumble that vibrated one's internal organs. It felt as if God himself had turned on a giant rock crusher and thrown their city into it. People huddled together, hugging their children, praying, crying. Klaus Richter held his Lena, whispering words of comfort into her ear that he no longer believed himself. Pastor Emil walked among the benches, his calm voice trying to pierce the wall of terror. God is with us. God will not abandon us. But Hans Vogel didn't even flinch. He wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the steel entrance door. He saw it slowly but inexorably deforming inward, pushed by something unseen and monstrous. And then, the thing he feared most happened. From the ventilation grill near the ceiling, which was supposed to supply fresh air, came a strange, howling sound. It was as if a giant had put its mouth to the pipe outside and was sucking the air in with incredible force. The slight draft that had been barely perceptible before turned into a strong, steady current. Pages from the book Lena had dropped were torn from the floor and plastered against the grill. The shelter grew noticeably warmer. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "The ventilation is broken," another replied. People began to choke, not from a lack of air, but from panic. Hans Vogel slowly rose to his feet. All his 62 years, his entire dry, wiry frame, radiated an icy calm. He walked to the door and ran his palm over it. The steel was hot. Then he raised his head to the howling grill. He understood everything. This wasn't just a bombing. It was a firestorm. Thousands of tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs had created a gigantic column of superheated air above the city, rushing upwards at hurricane speeds. To take its place, streams of cooler air from the periphery rushed toward the epicenter, creating fire tornadoes with temperatures of 1,000 degrees. This fiery monster was breathing, and right now, it was taking a breath. It was sucking the oxygen from every crack, every basement, every shelter. Their bunker, their fortress, was turning into a giant vacuum-sealed bag. "Close the ventilation!" Klaus yelled, jumping up. "Now!" Several men rushed to the damper, but Hans stopped them with a single, short, authoritative gesture. "Useless," he said quietly. His voice sounded surprisingly loud in the ensuing silence. "The pressure outside is too great. It will be torn off. And even if you close it, it will suck the air through the cracks in the doors, through the concrete itself." The people stared at him, uncomprehending. Who was this old man? What was he talking about? "The exits," stammered Schmidt the baker. "We have to check the exits." Two sturdy men, workers from a nearby shipyard, rushed to the steel door of the main exit. They threw their weight against the massive wheel lock. It wouldn't budge. They braced their feet against the wall, their muscles bulging with strain. The wheel didn't move an inch. "The emergency exit," someone else shouted. The story repeated itself. Both doors were blocked from the outside by tons of burning debris. The realization did not come at once. It washed over them in slow, icy waves of horror, eroding the last vestiges of hope. They were buried alive, in a sealed concrete box, in the center of a fiery hell that was slowly but surely draining the life out of it. He looked at their frightened, tear-stained faces, then at the massive 1.5 meter, about 5 feet thick concrete floor. And in that moment he knew, if they were to survive, he had to become not just their savior, but a tyrant, a prophet of an insane idea. He had to make them believe in the impossible. The first few hours after the realization were the worst. The horror wasn't loud or hysterical. It was quiet, sticky, spreading through the shelter like a poisonous gas. People sat on the benches, staring at a single point. Mothers silently hugged their children who were no longer crying but merely whimpering, instinctively sensing the suffocating atmosphere. The air grew steadily warmer and drier. Breathing was difficult, as if a hot slab had been placed on one's chest. Every breath required effort. The howling from the ventilation grill never stopped, becoming the backdrop to their despair. A funeral dirge performed for them by the city itself. The first to break was a young student sitting by the wall. He suddenly jumped up, his eyes wild. I can't breathe in here!" he screamed, rushing to the main door and pounding on it with his fists. "Let me out! Open up!" His scream broke into a croak. He slid down the door, gasping for air, and fell silent. No one went to him. Everyone understood it was useless. This was the first stage, denial and panic. Klaus Richter tried to take control of the situation. As an engineer, he thought logically. "Calm down." His voice trembled, but he tried to sound confident. "We need to conserve air. Move less. Don't panic. The rescuers already know about us. They will clear the rubble. We just have to wait." His words were reasonable. They were logical. And they were utterly useless. Hans Vogel, standing aside, listened with a bitter smirk. Wait? These people didn't understand what they were up against. There were no rescuers up there. There was a firestorm that would rage for many more hours, perhaps days. No one would come near this district until the ground cooled. And by the time it did, all that would be left here were 200 corpses, sitting in neat poses as if they had simply fallen asleep. He took inventory. A few tanks of non-potable water, no food apart from the pitiful sandwiches people had brought with them. The emergency lighting, judging by the dimming lamp, wouldn't last much longer. But the main problem wasn't hunger or thirst. The main problem was the air. Or rather, its disappearance. Hans walked to the center of the room. He cleared his throat, drawing attention. "No rescuers are coming," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. "What are you saying, old man?" Schmidt the baker protested. "Don't spread panic." "This isn't panic. It's a fact." Hans scanned them all with a heavy gaze. "Up there is a firestorm. I know what that is. It creates a draft, like in a chimney. Our shelter is the bellows fanning this fire. It's sucking the oxygen out of us. Every hour, there will be less. In 5, maybe 6 hours, people will start losing consciousness. Children and the elderly first. 2 hours after that, everyone will be dead." A dead silence fell. The only sounds were the howling of the vent and the heavy, ragged breathing of 200 people. His words were more terrifying than any explosion. They were cold, like a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting the very essence of their situation, leaving no room for illusions. "And what do you suggest? Praying?" Klaus asked sarcastically. He saw Hans as nothing more than an old fearmonger. "No," Hans replied, and for the first time, a strange mad glint appeared in his eyes. "I suggest we dig." He pointed his bony finger down at the concrete floor. "We can't get out, but we can go down." A supply of rebreather plates, if this had been a military bunker, might have bought them a few hours. But this was a civilian shelter. There was nothing. They had only a few hours of air left. It seemed it was all over. But it was then that the quiet old fireman spoke the words that were both salvation and madness. 3 meters, about 10 feet. Below us runs the main sewer line. There is air down there. Hans Vogel's words hung in the hot, thin air. For a second, too, people just stared at him, trying to process what they had heard. And then the shelter exploded. Not from a bomb, from laughter. It wasn't cheerful laughter. It was the hysterical, bitter laughter of people standing on the edge of the grave, who had just been offered a shovel as a means of salvation. "Into the sewer!" shouted Schmidt the baker, choking on laughter and tears. "The old man's lost his mind! He wants us to drown in filth so we don't suffocate." A chorus of voices supported him. "He's insane! Shut him up! We will wait for help!" Klaus Richter stepped forward. He was angry. This old man was destroying the fragile discipline he was trying to build. "Listen," he addressed the crowd, ignoring Hans. "We must remain calm. The main thing is to conserve our strength and oxygen. Any physical labor right now is suicide. We will sit quietly and wait." But Hans was not about to back down. He walked right up to Klaus. They were nearly the same height, but the old fireman exuded such an icy confidence that the young engineer involuntarily recoiled. "Wait for what, son?" Hans hissed. "A quiet death? You're an engineer. You should understand. Bernoulli's principle. Pressure differential. Physics is killing us. And only physics can save us. Down there," he stomped his foot, "is a system. A huge network of pipes connected to hundreds of manholes all over the city. Even if half of them are blocked, the others will provide an inflow of air. Foul. Poisonous. But it will be air. It will be oxygen. Here," he swept his arm around the shelter, "there will soon be none at all." His words, backed by scientific terminology, made some of them think. But the majority still sided with Klaus. The idea of breaking through 1.5 meters of reinforced concrete with makeshift tools seemed fantastical, and the prospect of ending up in the stinking darkness of a sewer. Revolting. "We have no tools," someone shouted. "We'll find them." Hans cut him off. He walked to the wall where a small fire safety board hung. There was a pike pole, a shovel, and 2 axes. He took one of the axes. Its handle fit comfortably in his calloused hand. Then he pointed to the massive wooden benches. "Here are our levers. Here are the handles for our hammers. The steel legs of the benches. Those are our wedges and chisels. The rebar in the walls, if we can get to it, will be our best crowbars." He spoke like a man who had already thought everything through, who had seen the entire process from beginning to end. The blueprint for their salvation was already in his head, but he needed hands to do the work. "Who's with me?" he asked, his burning gaze sweeping over the crowd. One man stepped forward, then another. They were the same shipyard workers who had tried to open the door, men of hard physical labor. They didn't fully understand his theory, but they understood something else. It was better to die doing something than to sit and wait for death. "This is madness," Klaus yelled. "You'll kill us all. You'll burn up what little air we have left." But no one was listening to him anymore. Hans Vogel, that quiet, unassuming old man, had transformed into a leader in minutes. He didn't ask. He didn't persuade. He simply showed them the only alternative to a passive fading away. And that alternative, however monstrous, offered the most important thing: hope. He struck the concrete floor in the center of the shelter with the back of the axe. The sound was dull, pathetic, but it was the first blow. The first note in the symphony of their desperate struggle for life. This first victory over apathy and fear was fragile. The group was split. The majority still huddled around Klaus, watching the handful of madmen with disapproval and fear. They saw the benches being broken, the attempts to knock out the steel pins from their mountings. They heard the heavy breathing of the workers and felt the air grow even hotter and denser. But Hans paid them no mind. He knew that soon, very soon, when the first of them began to truly suffocate, they would come crawling to him, begging to be given a hammer. The first shift lasted no more than 15 minutes. The 2 shipyard workers, Walter and Kurt, and Hans himself. They struck the concrete with axes and the heavy pike pole. The result was depressing. The smooth surface of the floor was only marked with pathetic scratches. The concrete, designed to withstand a direct hit from an aerial bomb, seemed to mock their efforts. The people in Klaus's camp watched them with grim satisfaction. "We told you so," they whispered. "A waste of energy." Klaus went to his wife, Lena. She was breathing heavily, her face pale. "Hold on, my love," he whispered. "It will be over soon." He still believed in rescuers, believed in a miracle. Hans stopped the work. He went to the tank of industrial water and poured a little into a cup. He didn't drink. He poured the water on the spot they had been striking. "This will keep the dust down and soften the concrete," he explained, addressing no one in particular. Then he called over Walter, the largest of the workers. "Strike one spot. Don't swing wide. Short, precise blows. Imagine you're cracking a nut, not chopping a tree." He established a brutal routine. 15 minutes of work, an hour of rest. They worked in teams of 3. He divided his few supporters into 4 shifts. He himself worked in every one. He barely slept, only occasionally sitting down by the wall and closing his eyes for a few minutes. He organized strict water rationing, 1 small sip per person every 6 hours. Children and pregnant women received a double portion. When someone tried to object, he just looked at him in a way that made the man choke on his words. His authority was no longer challenged. At least, not in his small group. He became a machine for them, a ruthless, efficient survival machine. They were no longer people, they were tools. And he was the engineer who used these tools with cold precision. Hour by hour, blow by blow, they gnawed at the concrete. First, they removed the top, hardest layer. Then, using steel pins from the benches as chisels and a piece of rail they found in a corner as a hammer, they began to chip away at the concrete, exposing a skeleton of steel rebar. Every centimeter was gained with incredible difficulty. Their hands were covered in blisters that immediately burst, turning into bloody wounds. Their muscles burned with fire. Their lungs were torn by the lack of air and the concrete dust that, despite the water, hung in the air as a thick suspension. Their small empire, built on hard labor and iron discipline, gave them something more than just hope. It gave them a purpose. It saved them from the madness of passive waiting. They weren't waiting for death. They were fighting it. The people in Klaus's group watched them with growing anxiety. Their apathy was replaced by envy. They saw that these madmen, these suicides, were still alive, while they themselves were weakening with every hour. Little Otto, Greta's son, began to wheeze. His asthma had flared up in the thin, dusty air. Pastor Emil approached Hans. "They are dying," he said quietly. "Your work is taking their last breath." Without stopping his work, Hans answered without looking at him. "My work is their only chance. If we stop, we all die. This way, some have a chance to survive." The pastor looked at him for a long time, then nodded and returned to Klaus's people. He sat next to Greta and began to read a prayer, but his voice no longer held its former confidence. He looked at this obsessed old man and realized that salvation now lay not in the hands of the Lord, but in the hands of this godless, stubborn man with an axe. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. A strike, a rest, a sip of water, a strike. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of the new world. In the gloom of the shelter, in the camp of those who had chosen to wait, a rebellion began to brew. The crisis came at the end of the second day. By then they had dug almost half a meter, about 1.5 feet, into the concrete. It was an incredible victory, but it had cost them dearly. Several men from the work shifts lay unconscious from exhaustion. The air had become so thin that even at rest, one's head spun, and black spots danced before one's eyes. Klaus's camp was shrinking. People, seeing that there was no rescue, and that death by suffocation was drawing ever nearer, crossed over to Hans's side one by one, offering their weakened hands for the work. But Klaus himself persisted. His stubbornness was fueled by fear for Lena. He saw how hard it was for her to breathe and was convinced that the physical labor and dust would kill her and their unborn child. He gathered his last supporters around him, about 20 men, mostly those whose families were with him. "He'll kill us all," Klaus hissed, pointing at Hans's back. "Look at yourselves. We can barely breathe, and he's making people swing a sledgehammer. We have to stop him, tie him up, and wait for help." His words found an audience. Desperation is fertile ground for rebellion. They moved toward the center of the shelter where the next shift was working. Klaus walked in front. His face was contorted with anger and fear. "Stop!" he yelled. Walter and 2 other workers stopped, looking at him in confusion. Hans slowly turned around. He didn't look surprised. It was as if he had been expecting this. "Step aside, Klaus," he said calmly. "Don't interfere with the work." "No!" Klaus stepped forward. "You are the one keeping us from surviving. You are a murderer. Because of you, we will all suffocate." He lunged at Hans. The calculation was simple. Tackle the old man, wrest the tool from his hands, and it would all stop. But he underestimated Hans. The old fireman was not a frail old man. Decades of fighting fires, hauling heavy hoses, and clearing rubble had forged his body into a spring of steel and sinew. He didn't dodge. He met Klaus with a hard, short blow of his forearm to the chest. Klaus flew backward, gasping for breath. His supporters froze in indecision. At that moment, Hans did something that finally cemented his role as absolute dictator. He didn't shout or threaten. He walked over to the water tank. Slowly, in front of everyone, he opened the tap. A thin stream of precious liquid began to pour onto the concrete floor. A collective groan of horror filled the shelter. Every hour of stoppage is one less liter of water, Hans said in an icy voice. Every attempt at sabotage is 5 liters less. Do you want your children to die of thirst before they suffocate? The choice is yours. It was a monstrous, inhuman cruelty. A surgical cruelty. He had cut off their path of retreat, putting the most valuable thing they had, after air, on the line. The rebels wavered. They looked at the escaping water, at their wives and children, and their resolve evaporated. Klaus lay on the floor, defeated and humiliated. Lena ran to him, helping him up. She looked at Hans with hatred and terror. She saw in him not a savior, but a monster. Pastor Emil approached Hans. "You've crossed a line, Hans," he whispered. "I crossed it the moment I picked up the axe," Hans replied, closing the tap. "There is no line here. There's only the bottom of the pit and those who dig, and those who get in their way." He had defended his law. The rebellion was crushed. But while they were dealing with each other, they failed to notice how their true enemy, suffocation, was preparing its final, crushing blow. Little Otto stopped wheezing. He just fell silent, his head lolling limply onto his mother's shoulder. The death of 7-year-old Otto was the point of no return, the silent bell that tolled for their last hopes. Greta did not scream. She just sat there, rocking the cooling body of her son in her arms, and quietly hummed a lullaby. This quiet, insane whisper was more terrifying than any cry. It penetrated their very souls, their very hearts, freezing them from the inside. Now everyone understood. Hans's words had been true. Death was here, among them, and it was silent, invisible, and merciless. It came not with fire and steel, but with every exhale that was not replenished by an inhale. Klaus Richter looked at the dead boy, and something inside him broke. His pragmatism, his faith in order and rescue from the outside, it all crumbled to dust. He realized what a monstrous mistake he had made. He had been fighting the wrong enemy. He had been fighting the only person who offered them a chance, however ghostly and insane it seemed. He stood up, walked over to Hans, who stood silently nearby, and held out his hand. "Give me the hammer," he said hoarsely. Hans looked at him, then at his bloodied hands. He said nothing. He simply placed the handle of the makeshift tool in his palm. From that moment on, there were no longer 2 camps. There was one group, 200 desperate souls, united by a single goal. They worked without stopping. Men, women, even teenagers. Anyone who could hold a tool struck the cursed concrete. Those who were too weak carried away the stone fragments, brought water and dampened rags to ease the breathing of those working. The shelter turned into a hellish anthill, a factory for producing hope. Their world shrank to this pit in the floor, to the rhythmic strikes, to the taste of concrete dust on their lips. They no longer spoke. Words were an unaffordable luxury, burning precious oxygen. They communicated with glances, with gestures. They became a single organism, a single will, aimed at the destruction of their prison. Hans was their brain. He directed their efforts, showed them where the rebar was, how best to strike to break off large chunks. He was everywhere, his dry, tireless figure flitting in the dim light of the lamp, which was burning ever fainter. It too was dying, just like them. They broke through the layer of rebar. Beneath it, the concrete was not as strong. The blows began to sound different, duller, wetter, and then suddenly, as Walter struck with the crowbar with all his might one more time, the tool sank almost half its length into the depths. There was a crack, and from the resulting fissure erupted a fountain of stench. It was a smell that made the eyes water and took one's breath away. The smell of rot, filth, methane, the smell of the underworld. But with that smell, a thin but steady stream of cool, moist air burst into the shelter. Air that contained oxygen. The people standing nearby instinctively recoiled from the stench, but then, Like sleepwalkers, they were drawn to the crack. They greedily gasped at this disgusting but life-giving gas. It was a victory. A terrible, ugly, but victory nonetheless. However, their greatest trial was still ahead. They had broken through the ceiling of the sewer, but the crack was too small. It needed to be widened to create a passage large enough for a person, and they had only minutes left to do it. The last emergency lamp flickered in agony and went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. The darkness that fell upon them was not just an absence of light. It was a living, oppressive substance. It was mixed with the thick, nauseating smell from the breach, which now seemed the only beacon in this ocean of gloom. Instincts, previously held in check by discipline and light, took over. Human nature, stripped bare to its primal terror, demanded one thing: to breathe. What Hans had feared most began. A stampede. The people, driven mad by suffocation and darkness, rushed toward the life-saving hole in the floor. It was not a coordinated movement, but the blind, panicked surge of a herd. Screams rang out, not of fear, but of pain. Those who fell were immediately trampled. There was the sound of cracking bones, of children's cries turning into death rattles. They, who had survived the firestorm, who had endured days of suffocation and hellish labor, were now killing each other for the right to take a single gulp of foul air. Hans knew he had seconds to stop this madness. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them. He knew where the center of the chaos was. He still held the fire axe. He roared. It was not a human cry. It was the roar of a wounded bear, the roar of a primal chieftain who tolerates no disobedience. Back! His voice, amplified by rage and desperation, momentarily drowned out the noise of the crowd. He began to fight his way to the hole, using not the blade, but the shaft of the axe. He swung wildly, mercilessly, pushing bodies away, creating a small free space around himself. Someone grabbed his leg. He kicked them away without looking. His task was not to punish, but to separate, to reach the epicenter and become a wall. He reached the breach. A whirlpool of bodies swirled around him. He stood over the hole, legs wide apart, and lowered the axe. "No one passes!" he snarled into the darkness. "I'll kill anyone who tries!" There was a short, tense pause. The people encountering this unexpected obstacle stopped. They couldn't see him, but they felt his unbending will. "Listen to me," he continued, breathing heavily. "Children first. Women. Take the children and come one at a time. Men, form a corridor. If anyone tries to cut in line, I will split their head open. Do you understand me?" His words were brutal, his threat real. But in this absolute chaos, his tyranny was the only form of order, the only chance for salvation. The first to help him was Klaus. Finding himself nearby, he began pushing people back, shouting, "Children to the front! Make a path for the children!" Walter and Pastor Emil joined him. They became a human chain, pushing the maddened crowd away from Hans and the life-saving breach. The most terrible procedure of their lives began, the passing of the children. In the darkness, mothers felt their way forward, pushing their little ones through the living corridor. Hans took them one by one. He lowered them into the narrow, foul-smelling opening, into the unknown. "It's not deep," he shouted after them. "Stay together." Then came the women. Lena was among the first. As she passed Hans, she paused for a second. In the dark, she couldn't see his face, but she whispered, "Thank you." That word was enough. It was worth more than any reward. It washed away all the blood, all the cruelty, all the filth from his soul. He saved almost 100 people that night, 173 to be precise. The other 27 died in that terrible stampede or suffocated before their turn came. When the last survivor had descended, Hans was left alone in the dead, empty shelter. He stood for a moment in the silence, listening to the voices from below, and then jumped into the hole himself. Salvation smelled like hell. Their journey through the underworld lasted 3 days. The sewer tunnels of Hamburg were an endless, branching labyrinth. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint light that sometimes filtered through storm drains high above. They waded knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in a cold, viscous sludge of sewage, garbage, and water from burst pipes. The smell was so strong that for the first few hours, many vomited non-stop. But they were breathing, and that was all that mattered. Hans Vogel led them. He didn't know the exact map of these catacombs, but his instinct, his understanding of how a city is built, guided his direction. He led them away from the center, from the epicenter of the firestorm, toward where the city met the suburbs, where there was a better chance of finding an intact manhole. They moved slowly, supporting one another. Klaus walked beside Hans, having become his right-hand man. He helped women and the weak over obstacles. Pastor Emil walked in the middle of the column, his quiet prayers and words of encouragement keeping people from falling into complete despair. They barely spoke. Only occasionally would someone stumble, followed by a splash and a quiet curse. Sometimes a dull roar would sound from above. It was the war, continuing over their heads in another, almost forgotten world. They fed on fear and hope. They had no food, no clean water. They were at the limit of human endurance. On the third day, Hans stopped. He saw ahead what they had been searching for so long, a vertical ladder of rusty rungs leading up into a patch of gray light. It was a manhole. Walter, being the strongest, climbed first. With difficulty, he pushed aside the heavy cast iron cover. A shaft of daylight struck down, blinding them, and with it came a smell, the smell of burning, of ash, and of death. But it was the smell of freedom. They climbed out one by one, squinting in the unfamiliar light. What they saw was worse than any nightmare. The city was gone. In its place, a black, smoldering desert stretched to the horizon, dotted with the skeletal remains of buildings like a dead man's rotten teeth. The sky was gray with ash. They had emerged on the outskirts of the Wandsbek district. No one met them. There were no rescuers, no soldiers, no doctors. Only a few other ghosts like themselves wandering the ruins in search of food or water. Their feat, their incredible story of survival, dissolved into the universal, all-encompassing grief. They were just a drop in an ocean of suffering. A few hours later, a military patrol picked them up. They were taken to a filtration camp, fed hot soup that tasted like the food of the gods, and interrogated. Hans Vogel told them everything, just as it had happened. About the firestorm, the vacuum, the decision to break through the floor, the sewers. The officer, a young lieutenant with tired eyes, listened, nodded, and wrote it all down. But in his eyes, Hans saw no surprise, no admiration. He saw only disbelief and suspicion. The story sounded too fantastic. Break through 1.5 meters of concrete? Lead 100 people through the sewers? For the authorities, trying to manage the chaos of apocalyptic proportions, they were just a group of civilian survivors. Nothing more. A reenactment that could have confirmed their story was never conducted. There was no time for it. Their brotherhood, forged in a concrete hell, was destroyed. Their feat was buried alive under tons of bureaucratic reports and general indifference. The fates of the survivors from the Hammerbrucker Strasse bunker varied, but nearly all were marked by the seal of the horror they had endured. They could not forget the taste of concrete dust, the smell of the sewer, or the dead eyes of little Otto. Klaus and Lena survived. Their son was born 2 months later, a healthy, screaming boy they named Max. But Klaus could never forgive himself for his mutiny. For the rest of his life, he considered himself responsible for the deaths of those who perished in the stampede. He became a withdrawn, silent man, haunted by nightmares until his old age. He never worked as a civil engineer again. He said he could no longer trust concrete. Pastor Emil continued his service, but his sermons changed. He no longer spoke of divine mercy. He spoke of the strength of the human spirit and the darkness that lives in every soul, ready to burst forth in a moment of desperation. His parishioners found him strange, a little unhinged. Walter, the shipyard worker, lost his entire family in the bombing. After the war, he left Hamburg, and no one ever heard from him again. It was said he joined a monastery. Greta, the mother of the deceased Otto, never recovered from her loss. She spent the rest of her life in a mental institution, humming lullabies to a non-existent son until her final day. And Hans Vogel, the man who saved 173 souls, returned to his destroyed home, or rather, to what was left of it. He asked for no rewards, no recognition. He was too old and too wise for that. He knew that a true feat is always performed in silence and obscurity. To the new administration, he was just a pensioner, one of thousands who had lost everything. His story, written down by a tired lieutenant, was filed away in a folder labeled Incredible Testimonies and sent to an archive, where it vanished forever. Hans lived for 5 more years after the war. He died quietly in his sleep from a heart attack. He was buried in a small cemetery in Ohlsdorf. His modest headstone was engraved only with the dates of his life and death. Not a word about how this man had once punched a hole into hell to give people a chance to breathe. But, as the old groundskeepers who tended the cemetery used to say, strange things would sometimes appear on his grave. Wet river stones that smelled of silt, or pieces of old rusty rebar. Who brought them? No one knew. The official history of Operation Gomorrah is one of numbers. Thousands of tons of bombs dropped, tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands of buildings destroyed. In these dry, terrifying figures, there's no room for the story of 200 people in one particular air raid shelter. Their struggle was too personal, too insane to make it into the annals of history. The authorities did not want to admit that their vaunted, impregnable bunkers could turn into deadly traps. And the survivors did not want to remember. It was too painful to return to that darkness, to that stench, to that animalistic terror. They buried the story deep in their memories, just as they buried their fallen comrades. But the story did not disappear without a trace. It became a legend. Among the diggers and urban explorers of Hamburg's catacombs, a tale is still told of the ghost bunker. They say that somewhere in the Hammerbrook district, there's a sealed shelter with no way out. But if you press your ear to the ground on a certain day, you can hear dull, rhythmic thuds from beneath the earth, as if someone down there is still trying to break through to the surface. Among the descendants of those who survived that night, a strange family belief is passed down in whispers. They are taught never to fear the smell of dampness and never to complain about bad air, because their grandfathers and great-grandfathers once learned the true price of a single breath. They paid for it with blood, madness, and a piece of their souls. This story is not just a chronicle of survival in inhuman conditions. It is a parable that sometimes the path to salvation leads not up, toward the light, but down, into the darkness. That civilization is a thin veneer that peels away at the first serious test, revealing the primal will to live, and that a true hero is not one who leads armies into battle, but one who, in utter darkness when all others have given up, picks up a hammer and begins to strike the wall separating his world from hell, even if, in order to survive, that wall must be broken.